My dad was buried 2 days ago. It had been 6 days since he left, and I was still in a fog of despair. You see, my father was not like many fathers I have heard about in my life. He was a beacon of hope for me, my whisperer when I couldn't get out of my thoughts. My dad was my rock, and I leaned on him, probably overloading him with my problems over the years. He accepted it all, and yes, I knew that meant he loved me very much. I heard panegyrics, but they went past one ear and out the other. My brother and sister said many wonderful things about our father. Even his stepchildren, who came into his life later, said something that surprised me, praising him for helping them become whole. Some of these things I had never heard before because I was too busy with my own messed up life to pay attention. This day was just another in a string of terrible days since he died. The family was sorting through his personal belongings. My father and his wife lived in a rather small house. Although it was a lovely little cottage near the lake in their hometown, it was barely more than a mobile home. It was still difficult for me to call her mom because she came into his life when I was already an adult. In the courtyard was his office, another room of about 50 square meters, and I was given the unpleasant task of starting there, sorting through the boxes containing his memories of us, many of them from our childhood. In this regard, my father and I were not alike. As I looked through the trinkets and junk, it struck me how different we were. Why would he keep these trophies, I thought. Of course, he coached our teams, and there were even mementos from my little sister's miracle soccer season, as we called it when I was helping out as an assistant coach. My father's secret to success was that he made each member of the team slightly, and sometimes significantly, better than they were at the beginning, rather than simply focusing on those who already had the skills. That magical season ended with us winning the championship despite missing two of our top three players. It was an unforgettable day, considering that I didn't even give us a chance to win. But time and time again, I heard the same thing at eulogies the day before, whether personal or professional. Dad always managed to pull a rabbit out of the hat. Wrapped in some kind of film, I saw papers and an envelope that aroused my curiosity. I carefully unwrapped the package, and right at the top was an envelope marked Deborah. This is my name, Deborah Holt, daughter of the late Robert Holt. Below my name was written, "Letters to my daughter." A tear rolled down my cheek as I thought about what I might find inside. Of course, he told me all the important things while he was alive. Or not. "Deb," the letter began, and I almost lost my composure right there. Everything was too fresh. Through eyes clouded with tears, it was impossible not to read the following words. "Sorry, baby," he began. "I was thinking about some things I didn't say. I think that makes me a bit of a coward, and I hope you don't think any less of me." I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. The fact that it was 7 or 8 pages long meant that, by his standards, he really was a coward. I couldn't bear it at that moment. The letter went back into the box until my mind snapped back into gear, and then I folded it and put it in my pocket. I went to the bathroom so no one could see me and wiped my eyes. After going to the toilet and finding my brothers and sisters, I made up an excuse that I needed to go get food and asked what everyone wanted. I took the orders and went alone with my grief. And of course, I knew that it would be pure suffering. My father was my rock, and he was many things to many people throughout his life, but I was not my father. I was a complete disappointment. Every time I leaned on my father, he leaned on me too, and not always in a good way. We've had some pretty uncomfortable conversations throughout my adult life. I often lived in my father's shadow, and this simple fact angered me to the core. It wasn't always like this. In fact, I saw more of my father's weaknesses when I was still a child. This was quite logical because he was younger then and did not have time to learn from his mistakes. My mother was as kind and attentive as I remember. I remember because by that time she had already made friends at work and began to spend time with them and not with us. They were a bad influence on her, but I didn't realize that until many years later. Dad argued with her almost every day for a year, it seemed. She was adamant and even humiliated him, letting him know that she was her own boss. "This is my time and my body," I remember her telling him one day, As a child, I often felt afraid and anxious. It's strange, but even at such a young age, I somehow understood that they would not be together for long. After some terrible fights and insults, I started wanting them to break up, and I didn't have to wait long. I later found out that one of the men she met at the bar got her hooked on illegal substances, and when Dad found out, his lawyer explained the situation to her in detail. She disappeared from our lives. My brother and sister were too young to remember anything important about her, but not me. I parked in the Taco Bell parking lot, in one of the shaded spots, and took out the letter. "My dear Deb," the letter began, "I forgave your mother, and if you haven't, you should do it. Holding on to these negative emotions is unhealthy, and they wear you down little by little, creating a special kind of suffering. As the song says, bitterness prevents you from flying. I married your mother when we were both too young. I don't condone her behavior or my own. It would be unwise. I just want you to understand the pitfalls of our relationship. While I was working too much to make ends meet, we also didn't think about any protection. We wanted kids, so I didn't think much about it until I realized we couldn't afford to have kids that often. Later it dawned on me that your mother was stuck in the role of raising 3 children, and there was little I could do to help her. Of course," he continued, "I changed diapers, cooked food, and did everything a father should do, but I didn't help her emotionally. Because of this, I believe she first found solace among her friends and then in the arms of her lovers. To be clear, I did not make these bad decisions for her, but it would be a lie to say that I had nothing to do with it. Remember how I told you that it's always better to take 51% of the blame for your failed relationships? I want you to know that I apologize for my mistakes." From the very beginning, it was clear that he was asking difficult things from me. Maria Grimes, my mother, came to see me only 3 times after she left. One of these times, she was so drunk that she could barely stand. I knew she left a hole in my heart or soul because I had recently come to terms with it. By the time I started high school, my dad had already remarried. Sarah was a strong, strict woman. In her previous life, she was a devoted foster mother, so I guess Dad expected her to be good with his kids. At least he carefully assessed her abilities. Many foster parents have a bad reputation, and some deservedly so. But the fact that many of her adopted children continued to interact with her after they became adults told a positive story. The thing is, I didn't like her. And there was no particular reason for this. I just didn't like her. One of my biggest and probably worst decisions was an impulsive decision, the weekend I turned 18. This led to many consequences that held me back for many years after that. I returned to the letter and began reading the next section. "Deb," he wrote, "that Saturday afternoon after your 18th birthday when you said you were leaving home struck me. When you started screaming at Sarah and ran out the door, I ran after you. Sarah grabbed my hand and said, 'Let her go.' This led to a furious quarrel that neither of us could forget. You know that we rarely raised our voices at each other in anger. I didn't know this until almost 10 years later when my brother told me about it. I thought that Dad just took her side and let me leave. It was a stupid assumption because there was no side to take. I got angry and decided it was time to live on my own, and that was that. You weren't even wearing shoes when you left," the letter continued. "No bags, just your backpack. And when I finally stopped yelling at Sarah, I went outside, and you were already gone. I almost had a heart attack that day. I walked back and forth with sharp pain in my chest, and at times found it difficult to breathe. I've told you about this before, but I never told you how angry I was with you. I felt betrayed and abandoned. After everything I did to make your life better, you just left. I knew it too. My brother gave me a harsh assessment of what happened that day. He told me that my selfishness had an acute effect on the whole family for several months. I didn't care. That weekend was just a few months before graduation, and my friend, who had graduated the year before, wanted me to move in with her. The idea of independence took possession of me. She had feelings for me, as it turned out. When she found out that I didn't share them, she kicked me out. I reread his last sentence. Left between the lines was an equally painful subtext. "You just left," he said, but what he really meant was, just like your mother. It stung, and I involuntarily wiped my eyes. In all my plans that spring, I never once thought that my actions might hurt the person I loved most. I misunderstood Sarah's words, thinking that she didn't care about you. I continued to read. In fact, she gave me some of the best advice in our entire relationship. When I couldn't find you within the first month, I took my anger out on her, which led to our breakup and almost destroyed us. I knew little about this. At that time, I enjoyed my freedom. Dad was a great man in my eyes, but deep down, I thought he was too strict with me growing up. Like most children, I probably exaggerated his severity. Now, looking back, I understand that he treated us all the same. I admit I was pleased with myself when I heard that Dad and Sarah had separated. I didn't expect them to make up. The fact that Sarah eventually forgave me made me feel even worse later in life. When I finally realized that your leaving was not Sarah's fault, I continued to read. I began to do everything in my power to show her how sorry I was. And even then, it took her a long time to trust and forgive me again. I never used this period of our lives to teach you how to forgive or how to be repentant, so I failed as a father again. I had never seen my father as a failure, and I wasn't sure I wanted to continue reading this letter. I headed to my car at the Taco Bell drive-thru and ordered from the list my brother gave me. I only read the first page and half of the second. On the way back home, I thought for a moment about my first day of kindergarten. Maria, as usual, was not around, and it was just me and Dad. I was excited, but at the same time nervous about school. My dad introduced himself to my teacher, who was standing on the porch greeting people. Then he greeted his neighbors. When he kissed and hugged me tightly, I saw a girl my age who was crying bitterly. She was scared. At first, I didn't know what to do. None of the adults came to calm her down. I walked over and hugged her, and she hugged me back. I've heard adults say things like, "Isn't that cute?" and "What a good girl." When we released each other, she said her name was Lori, and I said my name. Someone with a huge camera came up to us and asked me to put my arm around her shoulders. He got down on one knee and took our picture. The next day I found out that we were in the newspaper, but I was too young to understand what it meant. After the photo, I accidentally looked in the direction where Dad had gone and saw that he was standing and looking at me. His pride penetrated me to my very soul, and I swear that day was the first time I consciously realized how much I meant to him. The rest of my school life was rather uneventful. My dad signed me up for softball, and I couldn't do it. The next season, he became a volunteer coach, hoping to help me. That didn't work either. Then it was football's turn, with the same results. My teacher invited Dad and Sarah to a parent-teacher conference when I was in second grade. A week later, I went to the pediatrician for an examination, and we left there with a small package of pills. I had to take them twice a day. A month passed, and one day Dad came home, breathing heavily. I knew something important had happened. After talking with Sarah, he sat me on his lap. "Deb," he asked, "describe to me how you feel when you take these medications. Describe your feelings and thoughts." I never took those pills again. Right after I entered seventh grade, my dad and Sarah signed me up to swim at the IMCA. Despite eating fairly healthy at home, I started gaining weight, and they wanted me to have a regular exercise regimen. The water turned out to be amazing for me. I adapted to it like, well, you get the idea. One day, I overheard the instructor talking to my dad after training. "She's a natural," the instructor praised, "but I don't want you to have too high expectations. Most girls her age have been swimming since they were 4 years old, or even younger." My father frowned. "I will ask you to change your attitude," he almost ordered. "The fact that she is my daughter does not mean that she will become an Olympic champion or even achieve great success. But my daughter has overcome every obstacle she has faced in life. So you train and leave the motivation to me, okay?" In ninth grade, I easily made it onto the school swimming team and often won races in the 100-meter backstroke and any distance in the breaststroke. Even before the school ball, The water polo coach suggested that I take up this sport in the winter to keep in shape for swimming. Finally, I found my sport. Dad came to every game whenever he could. This man worked very hard. I knew about it, but I realized much later how much. And at the same time, he coached my younger sister in soccer and did scouts with my brother. During those years, he often looked exhausted, and when one of us irritated him too much, he could snap. When I returned with lunch, I sat down at the old kitchen table, ate with my brother and sister, and we reminisced about our childhood. The brother told the story of how their scout troop went looking for fossils in the foothills and came across a rattlesnake. His brother, Russell, described with exaggeration how he froze in place, but then his dad grabbed him tightly and pulled him back at the last moment. My mind wandered to how Russ and Dad suddenly and completely fell out after my brother's wedding. I knew from conversations that this had greatly broken my father, and he did not know how to fix everything. It had been a long day, and me, my little sister Christy, and my brother Russell needed to spend time with our families. We agreed to meet the next day at 10 in the morning. I met my husband, Bailey, at the door. He immediately hugged me. He knew me well, and it didn't take a genius to realize how exhausting my day had been. He held me tightly, helping me relax my back and shoulders. Before he could say anything, our two incredibly active boys came at me with questions. Our dinner was full of various discussions. The children, Chris and Nelson, alternated between fond memories of their grandfather and moments of silence when no one said a word. I was amazed at how much Dad influenced their lives. We all felt a huge loss. Chris was going to stay at a friend's house for the night, and after his little brother Nelson went to bed, Bailey asked how my day was. He was a good person, always said the right things, and asked the right questions. He genuinely cared about me and the boys, even though they weren't his own. I mentioned the letter in passing, and later, when he hinted that it was time to go to bed, I said that I would be there soon. He knew I needed time. I grabbed my second can of Mike's Hard Lemonade since I got home and sat alone in the living room to continue reading. Looking around, I saw everything in a new light. All the little change we accumulated during this time, all of it would not have been possible without my father. He loved me, but he also knew when I needed to shake things up. I took out the letter again. "You know, I've always been proud of you, baby," the next paragraph began, "except for those days when I wanted to strangle you." God, why is he talking about this again? I read just one sentence, and I already really wanted to hide this letter back in the envelope. My thoughts went back to that terrible day. David, my first husband, was a good man and the father of my two sons. I introduced him to my dad a year and a few months after I moved out of home. Our front door wouldn't close because something happened to it. I asked my dad to meet me at Home Depot so I wouldn't buy the wrong thing. David's name already foreshadowed his legacy. People meeting him for the first time expected to see an Anglo-Saxon, but his mother was a purebred Spanish, and David clearly inherited her features. Dad was surprised too. He only knew David's name before that meeting. David also liked to dress like a gangster, which attracted even more sympathetic glances in my direction. There were three of us, me, David, and his cousin Jose, whom Dad met that day. Jose and my boyfriend used street slang mixed with a lot of curse words. I could literally feel the pressure building inside my dad, ready to explode. Finally, Dad looked at David after one of his many F words and asked him, "You're a tough guy, huh?" His voice was so calm and confident that both David and Jose froze, staring at him. "We're just playing, Padre," Jose said, as if trying to intimidate my father. But this did not make any impression on Dad. "You're either in a gang or you're not," Dad said, not taking his eyes off the shelves for the part he needed. Jose spoke first, and it was a mistake. "Yo, I was in a gang, and then I did time." Dad didn't react at all, continuing to look for the part. Then he grinned. "You didn't do your time." He didn't even look at them. "There is a big difference between prison and imprisonment in a temporary holding cell. You and David are just pseudo-gangsters. Maybe even pseudo-gangsters." David puffed out his chest, and I wanted to hide. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. But on the other hand, I have never seen anyone being insolent to my father. Dad turned to face David, looked at Jose out of the corner of his eye, and then focused on David. "Do you want to know what prison is?" he said, not as a question, but as a statement. "Then disrespect my daughter." My heart began to beat faster. They stood at arm's length from each other. "If you want to know what a hospital or a morgue is, then hit it. Say, 'Yes, sir,' if you understand. She's already been through this, and I won't let this happen to her again from some fake bandito." David earned even more of my love that day, but to be honest, he also lost a little of my respect. I watched his expression carefully in those few seconds before he spoke and could see the doubt in his eyes. He wanted to lose his temper and beat up my father. He probably knew what would happen if he didn't do this. His cousin stood nearby and witnessed. In the evening, Jose would probably tell his friends in detail how David chickened out. But my boyfriend surprised me. He looked my father straight in the eyes and said, too loudly, "Yes, sir." "Great," Dad said, keeping a straight face. "Now apologize to my daughter for swearing in a public place and acting like an idiot." David looked at me and apologized. I was stunned. Fast forward 5.5 years, we had 2 children, and things were going well for David and I. Both his father and mine helped make a down payment on the mobile home we lived in. I worked for a well-known delivery service. There was enough money, but there was some estrangement between David and me. I couldn't understand what was going on. Outwardly, our relationship was normal, but our intimate life had faded significantly. I chalked it up to our busy lives and daily routines. However, I had everything I ever dreamed of. Avi Albright worked the second shift in a warehouse for the company where I worked the day shift. He was half Egyptian and half Lebanese. For me and my colleagues, he was like a bronze god. Avi had this elusive, I don't know, savoir-faire, I guess. He did everything with special charm. His laugh was contagious, and so was his smile. He could make me melt every time he said something. He was not an arrogant person by any means. The people on his team respected him, and his results confirmed it. Professionally, he was a role model for me. When Avi started courting me, I'm ashamed to admit, I hardly resisted. My weak defenses only lasted a few weeks, and I knew that he knew the moment when he had completely taken possession of me. I made all the usual excuses in my head. For a long time, I blamed my phone for what happened to my life instead of blaming myself. David expected me to return home late, as usual. Often I had to stay on a second shift because someone didn't show up for work, but the sex was so amazing that I fell asleep with my phone on mute. The rest of the night, Avi and I just slept. Real panic set in when I woke up at 8:30 in the morning to the vibration of my phone on the motel nightstand. More than 20 messages, and my father's number was on the screen. The call was coming right at that moment. In the state I was in, I could not answer. I blocked out many memories of that morning. If it had been David's number on the screen and not my father's, I would have spent time getting dressed and coming up with another lie to cover up the first. One of the third shift selectors shouted, and we had an exceptionally tough night. I was too tired to drive and slept in the car. One of my friends was having serious problems at home. David was such a nice person that he probably would have believed any of them. Not my father. Looking at his face on the screen, I realized that I was in deep shit. He already knew what I did. Even if he didn't, he would understand as soon as I tried to lie. If David had called my father looking for me, I would have lost. My marriage will most likely never recover, and all for the sake of a night of stupid and great sex. I didn't even realize I was crying. I didn't want to remember this part of my life, and I needed to experience what my father was trying to say here. "You should know," the letter said, "I gave part of our money to the children's college fund. You will still find out about this when the will is read. That's why I scheduled it for a month after my funeral. I gave it in David's name. I like this guy." After that day at Home Depot, it turned out to be much better than I ever thought it would be. This didn't surprise me. Over the years, Dad saw David in a much better light. I think David ultimately checked all the boxes for my dad. The way he succeeded as a father probably had more to do with that than anything else. We have spoken many times about your indiscretion. He tried to be kind even in death. I've often wondered if my reaction to David that first day spoiled some of the cream between you two. However, you had the opportunity to learn to respect a man. You had Sarah. I had to make sure you were learning and not assuming, he said in his own words. And I shouldn't have challenged David the first time I met him. What you did wrong, you did to yourself, but again, I believe I failed you. If his letter had been like that, I would not have wanted to read it. He didn't let me down. What the hell was he talking about? He was the best father anyone could have. I tried to relax on the sofa. I almost fell asleep several times, but the consequences of what I had done to David and my family continued to haunt my thoughts. David and my father were standing in the driveway when I pulled up. Both were on their phones. Dad saw me first and turned off all the calls he was on. As I predicted, I saw his worried face as he approached my car, that is, until he saw mine. He knew. He wasn't the only one. I later realized that I didn't spend enough time before leaving Avi's apartment fixing my face and hair or trying to hide the evidence of what I had done. The children were at the mall with Sarah, probably at their father's suggestion. When David saw me get out of the car, he only looked at me for a second or two before turning his back on me and walking away. I didn't talk to him for 4 days, although I wrote to him several times each of those days. We finally talked, meeting at a quaint Mexican restaurant near our home. I found out that he lived with his parents and met with my parents' children. I myself was in such a mess that I hardly paid attention to what was happening and went away. David surprised me by asking questions instead of making demands. I expected him to show up with a manila envelope. He was always very determined. I answered his questions completely honestly. No, I didn't love Avi. No, I haven't stopped loving David. The main question I couldn't answer was, why? I left the restaurant feeling, well, delighted. For the first time, I saw a way to save our marriage and perhaps even strengthen our relationship. David and I took it slow. Over the next 4 months, we met many times and discussed deep, sincere feelings. Looking back, I realized that they were not as deep as they seemed on the surface. In the 5th month, David agreed to move home and invite us to try again. The boys were overjoyed with excitement and longing for their old life. I had dozens of conversations with Dad and Sarah about what forgiveness and repentance would look like. I felt that he was determined to put me in order. The day David walked through our front door, I was walking on air, the best day of my life, or so it seemed. But it took less than a day and an evening to realize that he was not next to me. He was there for us, that is, for the sake of his children. There was little mention of the special meal I prepared and the cake I baked in honor of our family reunion. I was not a very good cook and an even worse baker. I told myself to relax because the boys were destined to monopolize his time right now. The first night was worse than the previous hours. David climbed onto his side of the bed after completing his usual evening ritual. Watching him get ready for bed, and for the next day, this familiar picture, I involuntarily smiled, feeling the inner warmth. Climbing into bed, he fluffed the pillow and pulled the blanket up. I was so fascinated by his actions that I completely forgot how I was going to thank him for his kindness and forgiveness. But David froze, simply holding the sheet and blanket in his hands. He looked at me intently, his gaze was unrecognizable. "Good night, Deb," he said without emotion. Then he kissed me on the cheek, turned the other way, and pulled the blanket up to my chin. This was the second day that I could not forget, no matter how hard I tried. I held back my tears and sobs until his breathing told me that he had fallen asleep. Perhaps he heard my sobs before he fell asleep. When I was sure he was asleep, I carefully climbed out of bed and went into our bathroom, where I sat down on the floor between the toilet and the sink. I suffered many nights when we quarreled on the phone. I understood his pain and the anger it caused, or at least I thought so, but I guess I never understood how differently men and women experience infidelity. For me, since I didn't love Avi, it was just wonderful sex. When it's over, it's over. We decided to move on and together fix what was destroyed. My husband saw it completely differently, and I only realized this after our breakup. For him, his trust in me was lost, his commitment irrevocably destroyed by my transgression. Obviously, men have longer memories, or they simply are not able to forget and move on so easily. Every time I thought we were taking a step forward, his new outburst of rude insults destroyed all my hopes. I felt his disappointment and pain. Dad always tried to calm my fears when we talked. He said I needed to understand the damage I had done through my actions and find a way to make David feel whole again. But I couldn't do it, although I thought I was doing everything possible. I thought I knew what it was like to be depressed. But as I sat hugging my knees, I realized how different the feeling of his anger and pain was from just hearing about them. The man in our bed was new, more decisive, indifferent, and cold. His hatred would be much easier to bear. Over the next week, all my fears from that first night were confirmed. He interacted with the children as warmly and lovingly as always, but when they left the room or the house, he looked at me as if I were a random stranger who bumped into him in a crowd and spilled his hot coffee. Of course, I never got a chance to make amends. The next night, I said I was going to bed. I had already stayed half an hour longer than usual, hoping that he would start talking to me. He replied that he would sit still and see me in the morning. I just stood there like an idiot. He looked at me, or rather, through me. Then a small smile flashed across his face, as if he was pleased with himself. He stood up, walked over to me, and kissed me on the cheek again. I didn't have to cry behind closed doors that night. David didn't come to bed, but fell asleep on our sofa. David never came into our bed again. We never slept together again. He continued to fulfill his duties to the children every evening when he came home from work. After they went to bed, he either watched sports on TV or went into our small office and closed the door. I didn't try to get him to talk, but maybe I should have. Perhaps I should have gotten him involved somehow rather than just letting him drift further away. At first, I prayed to a God I wasn't entirely sure existed to help David find his way back and give me the wisdom to understand what needed to be done. I also asked for guidance on how to proceed. I wasn't afraid of my husband, but his behavior was so foreign that I was almost afraid of what he might do if I aroused any emotion in him. I also never told my father about this, and I still don't know why. This was not the whole truth. I was amazed at how easily I could lie to myself, despite everything I had learned over the years. I felt ashamed. I felt a constant sense of guilt. But beyond that, I was deeply embarrassed and didn't want to. No, I couldn't bear to lose my father's love and respect after it became clear that I had lost it from my husband. The weekend was even worse, if that's possible. Within the first month, it became obvious that David only scheduled time with the children when I was not around. They rose early and left home on each of the first 3 Saturdays he returned. They returned home either by noon or several hours later. The boys told me about their adventures while David was gardening or fixing things around the house. Exactly 8 weeks later, he returned from work, and I was waiting for him. There was no alcohol on the table, just some warm takeaway food. He noticed me at the kitchen table, not looking up when he entered. I told him to sit down and immediately made it clear that I was filing for divorce. "Are you filing for divorce?" he asked in disbelief. "This is already funny." In that strange moment, I realized that this was the first time he had shown any emotion towards me since his return. This only strengthened my resolve to consummate our marriage. "I screwed up, David." I was now calm. "I can't fix this. You can't forgive, and I realize that forgiveness isn't even on the agenda. I will forever regret what I did to us and our family. It's entirely my fault, but none of us deserve to live like this. I can't speak for you, but I refuse to live my whole life in conflict over one night of sex. It's not even a conflict. This, perhaps, I could stand until we got over it, but there is nothing between us. And it's not that I didn't try. Obviously, you're just here for the boys, which is admirable, yes, but I can't live like this anymore. Because you leave me without a relationship. Yes, one that I destroyed. I will no longer allow you to take away my self-respect from me and yours too. His last answer, one word, was forever etched in my soul. Whatever, he said as he walked away, leaving me sitting alone. Any doubts about how indifferent he was to me immediately disappeared. I wanted to cry right then. I wanted to call my father and ask if I could come see him. Suddenly, the realization of what I had done hit me. Was I like Marie? Just as she left us, so my actions, even if they did not amount to betrayal, in David's eyes, were a complete disregard for everything except myself, like Marie. I sat motionless, unable to say a word as he walked away. I wasn't stupid enough to think that people after divorce couldn't overcome their difficulties and live well, if not better. I just didn't want to be that person, a man who ruined everything and then gave up. I'm not one of those who give up, even if I'm a woman of easy virtue. I told myself to pull myself together. I remembered what my dad told me before the regional championship game, when we were both looking at the strongest player on the other team. She was not human, she looked like a hairless gorilla, which was clearly superior to me in height and weight. I had the records for goals and blocks in our school division. Ariana, as her parents named her, held the same records in her district. I had to play against her on both sides of the pool. Everything will be fine, my dad encouraged me. She's big, but use your head. Think. She looks like a Neanderthal who is incapable of deep thought. If she grabs you, spin, okay? Dad knew less about water polo than any other sport he played or coached. But just like at school, out of habit, I listened to him carefully. She'll try to get into your head from the very beginning, he continued. Don't let her. Just make a promise to yourself right now and stick to it. If she plays better than you, well, so be it. But don't let her outsmart you, okay? Spinning would have been a bad idea, but my dad gave me that pearl of wisdom that helped me become the best version of myself. We lost the game in double overtime, but Bertha, as my teammates called her, played her worst game of the season. His words helped me walk out of the pool with my dignity intact, no matter the outcome, and that's exactly what I did. I had to let David go, and I also had to come out with some degree of dignity. That's what I did. I only freed my first love because I became stupid, selfish, and ruined everything. When I finally told my dad 3 days after talking to my soon-to-be ex-husband, he was furious. I didn't blame him for not understanding my feelings or my position. I didn't blame him for not understanding women in general. Obviously, I had a bad experience with men, and he had an even worse experience with women, at least with Maria. In the end, I still fell asleep. The morning was gloomy. Several times I caught Bailey's gaze on me, who was clearly trying to understand something from my face. When the kids got up from breakfast to get ready for school, my husband asked what happened. I said that besides the fact that I didn't sleep well, my father left me a very personal letter. He asked what it was about, but I avoided answering, saying that I had only read a few pages. Bailey was a completely different person from David. Hell, he didn't even look like my father. My husband had a special gift, a sixth sense when it came to my mood, despite the fact that I tried my best to hide it. My dad didn't teach me a lot of important things, in my opinion, like how to manage your finances. The things kids need to become successful adults in a difficult world, life skills, as I've heard it said. He tried to make my life better because he felt guilty about how it started, but that meant he gave in to my needs and demands too easily. Sarah did the same thing, but she tried to have deep, meaningful conversations with me to show me her point of view. When I left home, I longed for freedom. From that time on, I could be proud of one thing. I did everything my own way. Of course, not everything turned out the way I wanted, but at least I owned the consequences of my decisions. Bailey had a lot of patience, there was no denying that. He didn't lecture me, didn't insist. He would just say something like, "This is one way to do it, but what happens if you try it like this or like that?" Sometimes I even agreed with him. Over time, he broke through some of my defenses, and I respected him for that. The better he got to know me, the more difficult it was to hide my true self from him. The most important question was why I hid my identity from my husband, who until now had done everything to win my complete trust. Well, he said with a slight smile, Let me know when you're ready to talk. I can't wait to find out everything. Conversations like this were common in our relationship. It was difficult for me in some relationships. There was no constant drama. Sometimes I even missed her. After everyone left the house, I took a shower and started getting ready for another day at my dad's house. The letter kept beckoning me, and I called my brother, saying that I would arrive an hour later. I sat down on the couch with a large cup of coffee. I needed some caffeine. I looked at my father's handwriting for a minute or two, afraid to delve into the letter again. When I was young, my dad's handwriting was neat and clear in block format in capital letters. In this letter, the letters were also in capitals, but written with some kind of indifferent attitude. His E's looked like 2 or 3 different letters and were hard to tell apart. In comparison, Bailey's handwriting was more feminine, cursive, and creative. I've certainly moved away from men like my father and David. This is probably why my father's death shocked me so much. I will never be able to see him, hug him, talk to him, or quarrel with him again. His letter was like an omen, perhaps a little apocalyptic. Of course, he could not know, but this letter was his way of getting rid of the guilt that was eating him up inside, all because of his useless and adventurous daughter, whom he could not understand. There was no chance he knew about Juan. I've always been attracted to dark men, no matter where they come from. Juan was the last one to enter the plot of my life. Like many before him, he was confident, courageous, and assertive, but not too much. We were in a long dance of seduction when I received a call that my father was in hospice and had less than a week to live. Juan was just another manager at a shipping company. From day one, he made it clear what he wanted from me. He directly said that he wants me. Of course, I thought about Bailey, and I certainly remembered the disaster with David. By the time I was told that my father had only a few days left, I had already convinced myself that I could be with Juan quietly, carefully, so that Bailey would never find out. But I had to put my life on pause. I took the letter, trying to find the place where I had stopped. I failed you. I failed you. Of course it was. But at least he was man enough to admit it. But now that's over. Of course, I came because you are no longer there, I thought. In a few weeks, Juan and I would resume our dance, and for that sole reason, I was glad that Dad was no longer with us. I wouldn't be able to look him in the eyes if Juan and I were caught. I looked at the paper again and continued reading. Dad's words sounded like the beginning of a lecture. My biggest mistake was not telling you everything about your mother. I thought I was protecting you. If you didn't know how terrible she was, there would be no reason for you to become like her. But I was wrong, the letter continued. To my great regret, you cope with her role perfectly. Understand that I am more disappointed in myself than in you. Do you remember what I told you that 51% of the blame is on me? So, I'm so disappointed in myself. Okay, that was something new. Did he wait until he died to finally scold me? I never considered my father a coward. You see, I continued to read, your mother was not a woman of easy virtue. She was just a cheap, fallen woman that I made the mistake of marrying. Another mistake was that I made her pregnant. I'm not saying it's a mistake because you were born. You made me and gave me meaning in life. The mistake was that we brought children into the world that she could not care for, and I was not ready to help her. I made other mistakes that I am now going to correct. I gave you too much freedom. It was because I loved you and felt so guilty for your childhood, for everything you and your siblings went through because of my sins with Mary. I should have been tougher with you. In fact, I should have treated you the way you deserved. It's never too late to take the right step. I wasn't sure I wanted to read any further. Was he really comparing me to her? I hated my mother, that bitch. She abandoned us and made our life unbearable for several years until Dad found Sarah. Deborah, you have a great sense of superiority, he said in his letter. You're as stubborn as your father and as frivolous as your mother, and that's a very bad combination. Bad because you can never calm down. You can't just stop and take a breath. When someone suggests this to you, you sigh and think, what do you even know? It is for this reason, Dad continued, that I took certain measures before I died to ensure the safety of my family. Not only was a college trust set up in his name, but when you read the will, you will discover an unusual provision in the prenuptial agreement. If you ever cheat on Bailey, David will have custody of my grandchildren half the time and your current husband the other half. If you refuse to sign this document, you will be completely excluded from my will. What the hell? You see, my dear daughter, I don't trust you. My father's words cut me to the core. I recently learned that you may be planning to cheat on Bailey. Crap. How could he know this? Yes, I failed you, he repeated. But you need to listen to me one last time, because life will only get worse for you if you don't take my words to heart. Bailey is not David. If you break his heart, it will be broken forever and will never heal. You will destroy a good man for your selfish desires. It makes me sick, I paused at the words, that my first daughter, my own flesh and blood, could become such a selfish person. This has nothing to do with love. I have always loved you and will always love you. You must understand that every action has an equal, sometimes painful, reaction. You must understand the consequences and what they mean for all the people affected by your selfishness. You have to learn this quickly because I can't stand the thought of you continuing to break people's hearts the same way you broke mine. The lump in my throat grew larger, and now I couldn't even breathe. I started hyperventilating and went to the kitchen to pour myself some water. I didn't make it to the sink and had to sit with my knees pulled up to my chest and try to breathe slowly and deeply through my nose. My father somehow found out about Juan. He passed away knowing what I was like. I wasn't a doormat, but that was undoubtedly what he thought of me. This realization had a devastating effect on me, and I cried much more than the day I let David go. For the first time in my life, guilt overwhelmed me physically in a way I was not prepared for. I probably lay on the kitchen floor for almost an hour in the fetal position. The most incomprehensible thing was that I did not have the opportunity to fix everything and never would, because he was no longer there. What did he think of me when I sat at his bedside? How could he hide his disappointment from me? What did he think of me in his last days? How could I make him feel this way in his last moments? Dark thoughts enveloped my mind like black demonic smoke. I saw knives in a block on the kitchen table and thought about stabbing one of them in my heart. That way I could go to where he is now and try to explain everything. But even before that idea left my mind, another thought, the realization that I was too much of a coward to do this, made me feel extremely nauseous and vomit on the floor. I finally pulled myself together as best I could and looked at the time. It was clear that today I would not be able to go to my father's house. I texted my brother to say that there was a small emergency that would prevent me from coming. I rinsed my mouth, washed my face with cold water, cleaned the kitchen, and treated everything with disinfectant. I made myself some strong coffee. An hour and a half later, I was again sitting on the sofa and looking at that damned letter as if it were the instrument of my destruction. Luckily, there was only a page left. Deborah, his stoic, condemning voice sounded in my head again. You need help. It's not my opinion, it's just a fact, and I'm going to make sure you get it. What was this supposed to mean? I thought. I made an appointment for you to see a psychotherapist on the 23rd of this month. If you don't go, I've given instructions to the people handling my estate to block your access to the inheritance and tell Bailey and David what you're up to. They will also find out about this at your work. I can't and won't try to make you listen to me anymore. The therapist is the one I went to after your mother left us. She is one of the best specialists I have ever met, and she has known your story for a long time. I'm sure her skills have only improved since then. Call this number and confirm your appointment today. My devastated state gave way to a wave of rage. Who the hell did Dad think he was to rule my life even after death? This was my life, damn it. He couldn't do it. By the time I had to pick up the boys from school, I had already come to terms with the fact that Dad certainly could do it. The whole palette of emotions that gripped me that day was so strong that I didn't even read the last two paragraphs. The question, how could he, was my main one, along with, why did he do that? I held on that night, through dinner, and even after the kids went to bed. Bailey knew me well enough to leave me alone if I was in a certain mood, leaving me to deal with my feelings on my own. Apparently, he decided that this was one of those moments. My brother texted me late that evening asking if I planned to show up tomorrow. I sensed the irritation in his tone. My brothers and sisters did not interfere with the work I did 2 days ago in my father's office. I started going through the box of my brothers and my old school things again. Attendance medals, crafts made in craft class, and a stack of little envelopes containing our report cards. All this apparently had some sentimental value for him. I removed the rubber band from the envelopes and began looking through them one by one. A corner of a piece of paper was sticking out of one of them. I pulled it out and unfolded it. It was a note from my dad to my stepmom, written in his distinctive printed handwriting. Sarah, don't tell the teacher anything about the medicine if she asks about it. I'm not asking you to lie for me or for her. If they ask, just tell them they need to talk to me directly. I know we don't see eye to eye on this issue, and I was really trying to see your point of view. Please try to understand that Deb has gone through more than a child should have to go through. I have to do what I think is right to protect her. This is my responsibility for the rest of my life. I was once called to the teacher for inattention at the end of the second grade. Back then, these pills were handed out by doctors like candy. For many children, like me, medications did more harm than good. Later, when I was in high school, I realized that Dad must have studied this issue and carefully weighed the pros and cons. I never knew Sarah had a different opinion. I reread the note again. At that moment, understanding finally penetrated my stupid head. For him, it was personal, much more than just 51% blame. He dedicated his life to helping me for life back then, many years ago. Not the way some parents dream of the day their child flies the nest. He put everything he had into it, and I was a big disappointment to him. Now I understood why he was so strict with me after his death. And most importantly, I understood what he meant when he spoke of failure. I held the letter in trembling hands. There was no point in opening it again because I knew every word by heart. I smiled internally, remembering how quickly I called the therapist. This whole story was simultaneously full of enlightenment and awareness. My dilemma now, at the age of 68, was whether to include Dad's letter in a box of memories for my adult children. I thought maybe it was time to make this a tradition. I was sick, but not terminally ill. Copped chronic obstructive pulmonary disease has taken more and more strength in the last few years. Bailey was always overprotective, always making sure I had my inhaler wherever we went. Over time, I learned to appreciate his kind, gentle, and loving manner. 2 weeks after my first visit to my dad's therapist, I blocked Juan's number, and a month later I quit my job. The therapist thought this decision was extreme, but she didn't know me well enough yet. I was going to earn my father's respect again, even if it killed me. I smiled, although there was no one in the room. I was proud of myself for achieving my goal. I also wanted my children to learn about my early struggles, just as my father explained his to me. Maybe it will help them, maybe it won't. They were much more balanced than my siblings and I were at their age. But I didn't dare tell Bailey the whole truth. I had my reasons for this. I gave Bailey a good life, and after that day in Dad's huge office, I poured everything I had into our relationship. I dedicated myself to our sons, to him, and to becoming a better person. Moreover, I dedicated myself to being myself, being happy in my own skin, and enjoying the results of my decisions. I thought about those last 2 paragraphs, which I only read months later, and I pulled the letter out again to look at them again with my old eyes. You see, Deb, his wise words concluded the letter. Failure is a part of life, and sometimes it can be the best lesson you can use to learn. Failure, mine and yours, is not final. It can only be measured by how it affects other people. Sometimes our failures can be beneficial, sometimes harmful, and sometimes both. I really hope you find your way, and soon, my dear daughter. This family needs more successes, more improvements, and more blessings, and a lot less failures. As I put the letter back into its tattered envelope, I only hoped that I had finally made my father proud. subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.